Welcome to Microdose Psychedelic Insights, powered by the Conscious Fund. This is the Psychedelic Insider Series, fireside chats with industry leaders in the psychedelic space.
Thank you so much for joining us for another Microdose Psychedelics Insiders session. My name is Alana Armstrong. I'm on behalf of Aldous, and we're here with Ronan Levy. Hi, Ronan.
Hey, Alana, how are you?
Excellent. Thank you so much. If anyone was tuning in a little bit early, you probably heard a little bit of the preamble, but so Ronan is from Field Trip, and I would love to just start it off for anyone who is really new by just introducing you properly and exactly what Field Trip does.
Sure. So I'm Ronan. I'm the executive chairman and one of the co-founders of Field Trip Psychedelics. Our mission with Field Trip is to bring the world to life through psychedelics and psychedelic-assisted psychotherapy. And we've really kind of chosen that as our mission because we're just fascinated and excited by the potential of psychedelics to both help people who are dealing with mental health conditions like depression and anxiety and then PTSD, and help them sort of see the world with more color. Because when you're trapped in those conditions, you know, it's hard to see outside of the black and white and grays. So it's really about helping them move from that situation of black and white and seeing a world in color. But we're also really excited about the potential and the expansive potential of psychedelics to help people who aren't necessarily dealing with mental health conditions to see the world with more color, with more creativity, with more empathy. And so we've really tried to build our brand and a company around trying to pursue both of those paths. And so we're doing that in a couple of different ways. The first piece of our business model is Field Trip Health, which is the rollout of a large-scale clinical network providing psychedelic-assisted psychotherapy. Our first clinic opened in Toronto in March. Our second and third clinics will be opening in New York and Los Angeles in the next few weeks, actually. And then we expect to be up to 6 clinics before the end of the year, with a view to scaling to 75 clinics by 2023, roughly. In the same token, we are also very active in drug and product development. So we're doing research in a scientific partnership with the University of West Indies on psilocybin-producing fungi, with really a view to 2 things. One is, for anyone familiar with the cannabis industry, there's more and more evidence that there's an entourage effect in psilocybin-producing mushrooms. That's not just about the psilocybin. It's the interplay of a number of different molecules within the mushrooms that lead to the therapeutic outcomes. So we're actively exploring that, as well as just developing cultivation techniques, anticipating that you may see a market emerge for the mushrooms themselves as opposed to purely synthetic products, like you're going to see hopefully happen in Oregon later this year on their ballot initiative. We're also, through our Field Trip Discovery, are working on conventional drug development, moving forward with the development of a molecule called FT104, which is a synthetic molecule, a synthetic psychedelic that hits the 5-HT2A receptor, which is the receptor largely known for triggering the psychedelic experience. And we hope to be the first drug approved of a next generation psychedelic molecule, so not psilocybin or MDMA, but a new version of a molecule sometime around 2026. You know, besides that, we got lots of smaller projects on the go. I just launched a podcast called Field Trip FM. Field Tripping. The website is fieldtripping.fm, and other fun stuff, but that's kind of the core of our business.
So that was a great answer, because there's lots of stuff to unpack in there. For those that are not so aware, with the clinic that opened in Toronto, it did get quite a bit of press. We can talk about that the next question, but it's very specific to one type of psychedelic, ketamine, correct?
That is correct. So when we were thinking about how to build a business in psychedelics, we started almost 2 years ago, actually, and spent almost a year trying to think about how to craft a business model that was persuasive and made sense. You know, what we realized was that there was a legal psychedelic that didn't need regulatory change, that didn't need legal change, and that's ketamine, which has been used for close to 50 years safely and effectively, and is actually approved by the FDA as an anesthetic, mind you, but it's approved for use in humans as by the FDA, and it's actually showing profound effects in treating mental health. In fact, Tom Insel, who is the former director of the National Institute of Mental Health, described ketamine as the most important breakthrough in the last, I think, 50 years in terms of treating depression. Now, that doesn't really factor in psilocybin and MDMA and the potential of the classic psychedelics, but it's a really quite profoundly effective molecule in treating mental health conditions. And so we're using it like a psychedelic, which means we're using it in the context of ketamine-assisted psychotherapy. So it's not a drug, it's not an antidepressant, it's not something you just take once or on an ongoing basis and feel better. It's part of a program really to shift people, much like other psychedelic-assisted psychotherapy does.
Could you just, again, for those who are newer to this, could you just kind of give us a little snapshot of what happens in a clinic that uses ketamine-assisted therapy? And maybe we can start talking about what that could mean if regulations approve, what that could mean for other psychedelics in that same sort of setting.
Absolutely. So psychedelic therapies and the evidence around psychedelics is really couched in psychedelic-assisted psychotherapy, really using the drug, whether it's psilocybin or LSD or MDMA or ketamine, as a catalyst to enhance the effect of psychotherapy. And so for patients coming into our Toronto clinic, the experience largely is that you come in, we do screen people. We only treat people with treatment-resistant depression in our Toronto clinic based on the regulations and guidance from the College of Physicians in Ontario. But you come in, we assess the patient to make sure that ketamine-assisted psychotherapy is appropriate. Ketamine as a drug is very safe, but it's not for all patients, and this type of therapy is not for all conditions. So we want to make sure that the patients coming in are the right patients who can really benefit from it, and the risk profile is really low. You'll have a consultation with a psychiatrist to make sure that it's an appropriate treatment. We will do some basic medical assessments to make sure that, because there can be some blood pressure, ketamine can trigger increase in blood pressure. So we want to make sure that you're physically healthy enough as well. Assuming everything is good there, what happens is you go through a course of a ketamine session. So the drug is administered to you. It typically lasts for about 45 minutes to an hour when you're in the trip or the dissociative state. As soon as you finish that trip, you're with a psychotherapist who will do a basic exploratory therapy session with you, really trying to understand what you experience. Because like the classic psychedelics, people often have clear visions or insights that they may not have come across before. So we really try to understand that and unpack that. So you'll do a ketamine session followed immediately by an exploratory therapy session. You'll do 2 of those, usually over the course of a week, and then the following week you'll do an integration session. So that's when we take all of the findings and understandings and learnings and insights that came out of the ketamine and exploratory therapy session and really turn them into action through typically more conventional cognitive behavioral therapy techniques. And so you do that 3 times over the course of our program. So a total of 6 ketamine sessions, a total of 6 exploratory therapy sessions, and 3 integration sessions. That's what a typical experience is like in our clinics.
Right. And so 2 things really stand out to me about this is that there seems to be, the model seems to be more holistic than other really traditional medicines, such as, SSRI, right? Which typically gets prescribed, and you don't have a lot of interaction with your doctor. Certainly, they're not trip sitting for it. The other thing that occurs to me is that the treatment is a shorter amount of time, whereas in the past, to treat mental health conditions, mood disorders, for instance, you kind of subscribe to a program that you're taking a pill every day. So that's pretty amazing. How do you create a business model where the outcomes are actually gained at such a short amount of time, and we won't call it a cure, but you're getting a quick outcome like that.
Yeah, absolutely. Permit me to nerd out on some of the science for a second. So what the way psychedelic-assisted psychotherapy works, as well as ketamine-assisted psychotherapy, at least as it's understood, because when it comes to dealing with psychology, it's hard to measure it on an objective basis. But what the leading theory is that through ketamine or other psychedelics, what happens is during the trip, the default mode network of your brain, which is kind of like the operating system of your brain, kind of tunes down. And as you're an adult, what happens is the default mode network gets more entrenched and more entrenched. And so your sense of self-identity and who you are becomes fairly rigid. It's kind of the same reason why adults find it much more difficult to learn a new language than children. There's just more neuroplasticity in children. And so what ketamine and other psychedelics do is they kind of turn down the default mode network, which through fMRI scans is also believed to be where the ego in terms of psychology lives, such that these defense mechanisms of self-identity get turned down. And there's a period of neuroplasticity that follows your trip that opens people up. Their defenses are down, their guards are down, and so they're more receptive to seeing the world in a new light, or more receptive to the suggestions that may come from a therapist or a clinical psychologist. And so what psychedelic-assisted psychotherapy is really doing is really trying to target the drivers of depression and anxiety. I mean, depression and anxiety are very much neurobiological experiences. There are chemical considerations involved in that. But a lot of the theory is that what creates the chemical imbalance is unprocessed and unresolved emotions. And so through the ketamine or the psychedelic-assisted therapy, two things happen. One is psychedelics and ketamine are natural antidepressants. So as soon as people have it, it gives them an immediate lift, and so their mood improves, much like an SSRI. But what's different is that it also opens them up, so you can actually go in and in theory, kind of tinkering with the wiring of what's going on in their psyche to really address the underlying drivers of depression, anxiety, PTSD, all those chronic conditions that people suffer with. The question about how you build a business model off of that, it's pretty simple. The truth is that these are profoundly effective treatments. With ketamine, which tends to be the shortest lasting treatment option, people can still go months with being depression or symptoms of depression free. And with psilocybin, some evidence suggests it can last up to 5 years or longer. But the truth is that for many people and most people, it's not an immediate cure. Typically, you'll have to go through a few courses of treatment. And the truth is, I guess, two things in terms of how we think about the business is one, just because you go through and work through maybe the drivers of your current depression doesn't mean that life isn't going to throw a wrench at you in the future that creates similar issues, right? Parents die, people die. That's part of life, and it can be incredibly traumatic. And so working through that. So, there's, as much as we love to send people off and think they're cured, the truth is life always is more complex than that. And the second thing is that, and this kind of touches back on our mission, which is, I guess it's estimated that 1 in 4 people globally are going to experience a mental health challenge at some point in their lives. So, that's roughly 2.5 billion people. So there's a large market for it in the first place. And that's just the people who deal with mental health challenges. Because we believe the future of psychedelic medicine, but medicine more broadly is more integrative, more proactive as opposed to reactive, there's going to be a large audience of people who come in and want to do therapy because it makes their lives better, not because necessarily their lives are bad, but because they want to feel happier, because they want to be more creative, because they want to be more empathetic. And so that really touches on almost every person on the planet. So there's a large audience of people, and then at the end of the day, if we manage to cure all depression and all anxiety and we can't run a business after that, I think it's an outcome that we'd all be prepared to live with as business people. So it's not a terrible place to end up.
Absolutely. And I wonder what your thoughts are about mental health as we are emerging, I hope, from a period that the entire world is emerging from a period of isolation and feeling a little bit anxious and afraid of the pandemic. What's going to happen? How I can't see my family. I need to move my family to a safer space. So what are your thoughts about that? Maybe we can zoom out. We can talk about psychedelics on a whole and psychedelic medicine on a whole. But what are your thoughts on that as we come out of this pandemic?
Yeah, I like to say that if there's a single person on this planet that hasn't experienced some degree of anxiety or rage or fear or anger or sadness, they're not really paying attention to their emotions, because you can't go through such a rapid global shift so intensely without feeling something. And the truth is like most people, especially in the modern world, where we very much live in our brains and not so much our emotions, haven't done the work or not terribly equipped to really process those feelings. And what I expect to happen is a lot of that is going to become more, create morbidities, right? Create anxieties, more entrenched anxieties, depressions, and all that kind of stuff. I don't want it to be, but like the truth is like, it's hard. Like life right now is hard and it's incredibly complex, and the feelings around everything that's happened are complex as well. And even the most equipped and people to deal with this are finding it challenging to make sense of this new world. So there's no doubt that I think you're going to see a very complex mental health crisis emerge out of this physical health crisis. I think it's already happening, but I think we're just starting to see the beginning of it, because a lot of this is going to take time to play out and really express itself. And if I'm being putting on my philosopher hat or my metaphysical hat, it's like, to me, it's kind of like not surprising that psychedelics are reemerging just at the moment that we're probably facing the most challenging mental health crisis that we'll ever experience. It's the power of these molecules, the evidence around them, the safety of them is just, it's so profoundly exciting. It's hard not to sort of think that somehow the universe lined this up just right. Not speaking specifically for business, but it just, it would be much scarier, I think, in my mind, if we were trying to use the old tools of just SSRIs or conventional therapy to deal with what's going to come out of the COVID crisis. So I think it's really fortunate we're at a place where attitudes are shifting and the science is really starting to develop around psychedelics and showing how effective they are.
Yeah, absolutely. Heck, I was seeing, of course, I have my Google alerts set to any news that comes in about cannabis and about psychedelics. And I was certainly seeing articles coming out about, hey, is this the perfect time to try psychedelics, when you're sequestered at home? I'm sure you saw the same. Kudos to Field Trip. Probably one of the most shared pieces of media I saw earlier on was the announcement of the Toronto clinic. So I wonder, my next question would be, what sort of pivots or what sort of, maybe even philosophical changes, if you want to zoom out a little bit, have you considered because of COVID-19 and because of this period of isolation or social distancing?
Yeah, it hasn't. I don't think it's changed our philosophy at all. I think we thought what we were doing was important, even in the most glorious times. Mental health challenges are still ripe. I think, just the human evolution from agrarian to industrial to now, like very highly dense cities, highly technology driven, a lot of social isolation. There's a lot of challenges happening right now. And from a mental health perspective, completely independent of COVID. So what we were doing was important when we started it. We saw it as a real opportunity to create significant impact and improve the quality of many, many people's lives. COVID has just really exacerbated, the situation we were walking into. I think the only kind of changes that we made, because obviously we had to slow down the rollout of our physical clinics because we couldn't get in and do construction or anything along those lines, was that it enabled us to invest in our digital infrastructure, which was always part of our pipeline and our plan, because we knew that to scale any kind of psychedelic assisted psychotherapy, which is a very high touch point, and then as a result, typically very expensive, you needed to build digital tools to really support patients to try and bring the cost down and make sure they have the best experience possible. So the slowdown in the physical rollout for us just enabled us to really invest in those digital tools that were secondary to the physical rollout. During the real shutdown during the pandemic, we just accelerated the development of the digital tools. So our patient portal, which we've invested an incredible amount of time into, because at the end of the day, when you're talking about depression and anxiety, it's not just about your emotions. It's not just about the neurobiology. It's about lifestyle. It's about maintaining habits and good practices and eating right and exercising and all of these other things that have an impact on our mental mindset and well-being. And so we wanted to build tools that can continue to support patients long after they leave our clinic. Now, what's happening from our first patients, because we always conceived of our ketamine-assisted psychotherapy program as being a way station along your journey towards mental health. But what we're finding is that the patients who come in for ketamine want to stay with us. They develop great rapport because we have wonderful therapists. They have great experiences. They see outcomes. And so, we're going to have to find a way to support patients on a much longer term basis than we had initially conceived of, which is a wonderful problem to have.
Yeah, actually, I touched on the holistic, the sort of holistic ethos that has been impressed upon me in the psychedelics world. And certainly one thing that appeals to me about psychedelics is that the treatment, whether, through a clinic or, outside, it does have this sense of holistic, pre-care, aftercare, and then trip sitting, which would be, kinetic care. I don't know, but can you tell us a little bit about the patient portal and how that benefits patients in that way?
Yeah, absolutely. So the patient portal, it really has a number of tools built into it. So at its core, it provides for asynchronous communication with your therapist, which I think is important because there are certain times when you want to talk to a therapist, but it's not immediately urgent. And so it enables us to make our therapists much more available to our patients instead of being direct one-on-one, which is a great, I think, asset for both the therapist and the patient. It also provides a lot of education material and preparation material. So when a patient walks in the door for their first ketamine session, they know what to experience. They've kind of done the mental preparation walking into it, because when it comes to psychedelic assisted psychotherapy, the intention you bring into a psychedelic experience has a significant impact on the nature and quality of the experience, as does the setting and the therapeutic protocols. And just touching on a business point, that's why we decided to build our clinics. That's why a new clinical infrastructure is necessary, because you can't go to a conventional doctor's office and expect them to administer ketamine and permit you to sit there for an hour to 2 hours while you go through a trip, or psilocybin 4 to 6, or MDMA 8 to 10 hours. And so you needed a new space to actually hold people, but that space also needs to be designed in a way that really manifests a beautiful setting and puts people in the right mindset for a good experience. Otherwise, you increase the risk of a hard experience. They say there's no such thing as a bad trip. All trips can be therapeutic, but they can be easier or harder. And so we want to really create this situation for an easier experience. So Our patient portal provides patients with the tools to sort of prepare. It provides mood monitoring tools and other ways that we can track the patients. And we'll also be providing meditations. So in between sessions or after the fact, people can keep up good habits and good practices that help them process their emotions and really live, an integrated, holistic life with a view to mental health. So that's what's built into it for now. I mean, this is just a starting off point. We expect it'll build into more of a hub and a community as things evolve. But right now, it's just a sort of an individualized tool for each patient to really make the most of their experience before and after and during their course of treatment.
Amazing. I promise the question after this we'll start to talk about you specifically, Ronan. But I just
Sure.
I have a question about the psychedelic experience is so unique to the person and to the substance that that individual is consuming, and ketamine no different. How do you prepare a person for a psychedelic experience before they take one, if they're, let's say, novice?
Yeah, I mean, I'm not the clinical team, so I'm only speaking from my personal experiences and a little bit I know, but I think there's two real things that are involved with it, which is having people, engage and encounter any fear or resistance. I know in my sort of personal work with therapy, unrelated to psychedelics, there's always a feeling of dread going into a session. And then that's really your ego talking, saying like, I don't want to change. I'm pretty happy with who I am. But you have to go through it. So helping people just engage and be honest with that preparation, that fear, that discomfort. At the end of the day, you're going in, you're not fundamentally changing who you are, but it can be a pretty fundamental change in many respects. And so there's a lot of dread and fear that would come up with that. So helping people acknowledge that, and try to process that so they can walk in as open-minded as possible to the experience. The other piece of it is really intention setting. So walking in and trying to have a sense of what it is you want to get out of an individual ketamine experience or other psychedelic experience, and then, how to best process that with your therapist. I think those are the two big things, and there are different techniques you can do it. I mean, doing a meditation and trying to encounter those emotions is a great way to do it. Some people prefer just breathing exercises. There's a lot more science and evidence coming out that shows that breathing technique can really slow the heart rate, slow the brain, slow the anxiety response, and all that kind of stuff. And so it's those kind of things that the patient portal will provide to patients. And also just knowing what to expect, knowing that your ketamine experience is going to be about 45 minutes, but it could go up to 2 hours. So don't be surprised if you're still in the middle of it for this kind of long. Getting to know who your therapist is, obviously, you'll get to know them better throughout the course of treatment, but if you know who they are, you've seen their picture, all that kind of stuff, it's going to help build comfort and rapport and really, I think, position you for success as a patient.
I love it. Thank you very much for that beautiful answer. I want to talk a little bit about yourself, though, because I can imagine that venturing into psychedelics wasn't always on the cards for you when you were in high school, or maybe even younger. You probably had other things on your mind. What did you always envision yourself to grow up to be back in
That's a funny question. So as a kid, I always wanted to be a lawyer. Maybe it's a function of growing up in a Jewish household, and unfortunately being around lawyers too much as a kid, who always treated me nicely and played video games with me. I went to undergrad, I did business, then I got into law school and became a lawyer. The funny thing is, all throughout high school and even into first year of undergrad, I didn't drink, I didn't do drugs. I wouldn't say straight edge, but I definitely was not within the party scene of any of those things. So for me to have built a career in cannabis and now psychedelics, I think no one would have bet that back in the late 90s. That said, my path here was, I became a lawyer. hated it, to be quite honest. It was very soul-sucking and unfulfilling to me. I was always much too creative, and I relish challenging conventions instead of enforcing them. And while I think being a lawyer can really equip you to do that well, too many lawyers and too much of legal practice does the opposite. So I progressively went from private practice to in-house, and then launched out as an entrepreneur in 2011. Again, not with a view to cannabis or anything along those lines, but it was right within a year or two of that the regulations around cannabis started shifting. When I met up with my business partners in our last business, which was Canadian Cannabis Clinics and Cannabis RX, which we sold to Aurora Cannabis in 2016. So it was pretty cool building, much of the infrastructure for a global cannabis industry through Aurora. We were Aurora's first acquisition. What that experience really showed me was, when we started in cannabis, I think at best we were agnostic about the therapeutic applications of cannabis, and at worst we were skeptical. But we felt that, at least personally, I felt that any prohibition on access to cannabis with criminal penalties made no sense. So philosophically, even if every patient coming through our door was just looking for legal cover to access cannabis, I was morally and philosophically okay with that. But what we saw was that the people coming through our clinics were genuinely sick people genuinely suffering, and needed a lot of help. And the amazing thing was just how profoundly cannabis helped them. We got so many reports from so many patients. Sometimes it was as simple as, cannabis did nothing for my back pain, but for the first time in 7 years, I slept through the night, and realized just how profoundly impactful once stigmatized medicines, plant medicines actually have. And it really opened our eyes and changed my perspective quite a bit. And so when we left that and we learned about psychedelics, we saw the same opportunity, which is we can change minds, we can help a lot of people, we can, hopefully expedite the end of a war on drugs that has caused so much damage globally. Not to get too much into the politics of it, but there seems to be pretty good consensus that the war on drugs has not been a success, and create a lot of impact. So that's kind of how we landed here. And I, personally, didn't have a lot of experience with psychedelics. Like I said, I grew up not doing drugs or drinking at all. But I have, for the last 15 years, had a very active coaching and therapy aspect of my life. And so through, meditation and that work, I think I've had a lot of, call it semi-psychedelic experiences that have profoundly changed my life. And so when someone described that a single psilocybin-assisted psychotherapy journey could be it's kind of like the equivalent of 10 years of therapy in a single session, as like, this is something that needs to happen. If we can change attitudes toward mental health, if we can change the conversation from mental health being something that's reactive, that only depressed or anxious people do, to something that everybody should do, just like everybody should go to the gym. If we could change that conversation around allopathic medicine being very reactive to a more integrative medicine where we're very proactive about maintaining our health and wellness. I saw psychedelics as being a springboard for that in so many different ways. So, even though the potential of psychedelics and the molecules is so profound, I actually see philosophically it being a much conversation about just our attitudes towards life and health and well-being. And that's what gets me super excited about it.
For sure. Sorry, I know you don't want to get into the politics of it, but one of the questions I wanted to ask was, if you were to look ahead, I know, so Field Trip, the clinic, so the one in Toronto is dealing with ketamine, that is legal, that is FDA approved for use on humans. Legalization, decriminalization, medicalization, what do you foresee? What do you hope for the near future? And what do you think is going to make the biggest impact?
The answer is yes. So what I see, the future I see evolving is that there's going to be two parallel, very complementary systems. One is going to be purely medicalized, exclusively synthetic molecules, and exclusively for people with diagnoses of mental health conditions, depression, anxiety, PTSD, eating disorders. There's a countless number of mental health conditions, be purely medical and probably largely insurance covered because there'll be a lot of evidence, I think, and they'll have FDA approval. And I think you'll see the economics of psychedelic assisted psychotherapy versus conventional therapies will be much more persuasive, even though psychedelic therapies are going to be more expensive up front. I think when you look at the gains in lost productivity from people not being as away from work as much and all that kind of stuff, you're going to see a lot of employers come in and be really advocating for psychedelic therapies as part of their insurance programs, because it will genuinely lead to happier, healthier employees. And I think, even the cost itself, even if you don't factor the lost productivity cost, just the out-of-pocket cost, will be lower over the long term for patients. So I see that one program, and then I see a separate program where it's more wellness focused. I won't call it recreational because I don't think that's accurate. But it'll look very similar to what's going to be on the ballot in Oregon. For people who aren't familiar with what's happening in Oregon, they just got enough signatures to get the psilocybin services initiative on the 2020 ballot. So the people in the state of Oregon will be voting on the creation of the first true market for psilocybin without FDA approval. So, if you follow the cannabis industry, it'll be state versus federal issues all over. But what it will enable people in Oregon would be able to go to service providers, so therapists and other clinicians, and have an experience on psilocybin. Now, that could be a synthetic psilocybin, but it could also be the mushroom itself. And that will be open to anybody. So even if you don't have depression or anxiety, or at least not clinically diagnosed depression or anxiety, but you want to go for an experience on psilocybin and have a trip, you'll be able to do so. And what I really like about that model is, the biggest concern around psychedelics, even though the evidence out there shows that they're quite safe, with LSD and psilocybin, they're generally not addictive. It's incredibly hard to overdose. The biggest risk is that people, take a psychedelic and then, wander the streets and do something stupid. That's probably the biggest risk. We deal with it all the time with drinking. Somehow it's scarier with psychedelics. Either way, it's not the right outcome. And so what's proposed in Oregon is that you have to go to a licensed site. You have to go to a clinic to have this experience. So you're controlling it, you're ensuring the maximum likelihood of a good experience, minimizing any negative outcomes, but everybody's willing to participate. In a purely medicalized program, the problem is that you're excluding, if 1 in 4 people globally have a mental health challenge at some point in their lives, 3 in 4 people don't, which means all of those people who could still benefit from psychedelics would be excluded from a purely medicalized system. So I think you'll see both exist. Just like we in Canada, we have a medical cannabis system and an adult use system. I think you'll see a purely medical system for psychedelics and a more wellness-based system as well.
And could we talk a little bit about Basecamp? I know it's a newer announcement from Field Trip.
Sure.
And so Basecamp will be working with veterans specifically?
Not veterans specifically, frontline workers, what we're calling frontliners. So anybody in high intensity occupation. So that could be veterans. Obviously, they experience an incredible degree of intensity, probably more so than anybody who isn't a veteran could possibly imagine, especially when they're in theater. But that also means cops, firefighters, frontline workers in healthcare settings, emerge doctors, anybody who operates on adrenaline, for as a simple way to kind of measure it, on a constant basis, even a high performance athletes. They just live different lifestyles, and they can very much get ingrained in that always on mentality, that always operating at 1,000 miles per hour mindset. And it's exhausting. It really can suck the lives out of these people. And especially with cops and firefighters and soldiers and EMTs, they experience and witness traumas and really horrific things that most people, God willing, don't have to experience.
Yeah.
So they experience that at way higher degrees than the rest of the population. But to speak to them, and this was a learning experience for me, is that what we've learned from Adam, who's our director of Basecamp, is they don't want to be held as special. They don't want to, at least specifically veterans, they don't want a specific veterans program. They want to be seen as normal people. They're so used to operating outside of the normal sphere that when they're not working, they want to be back within the normal sphere. So they don't want to be talked to as being special or put on a pedestal or anything along those lines. They want to be talked to eye to eye. And I think one of the phrases that we're using is like, never above you, never below you, right beside you. It's like, that's what they want to feel. And so you got to speak to them differently, and the protocols are going to be different because it's just a different form of complexity in terms of the trauma and the depression that they experience. So that's what Basecamp is about. It's really trying to speak to people with high intensity jobs in a way that they can resonate with and offer them a program that's really suited to help them for their particular needs.
Beautiful. Yeah. High intensity jobs. I mean, there will be a huge need for it coming out of even just the COVID-19 pandemic, right?
Totally. Absolutely.
What was the impetus to create Basecamp? Was it, was it, a thought a long time ago, or was it a reaction to something in particular?
No, it was something that we took out of the cannabis industry. There are an incredible amount of soldiers who rely on cannabis to help address a lot of the symptoms that we're talking about. But cannabis isn't, it just helps address and like alleviate the symptoms. It doesn't address the root causes. So we knew there's a large audience of people suffering in that environment. So we always wanted to build a program specific for them. And so it just took a little bit longer than it took to build our, depression program, treatment-resistant depression program, before we could get Basecamp launched. But it was always part of it. These people put their lives on the line for the benefit of the rest of society. And so, we are grateful for it and definitely want to be able to give back and support them in ways that they can't find elsewhere.
Absolutely. Yes. The conversation between the VA in Canada and LPs or well, actually, the sort of allowances for cannabis. It's been a conversation that I've followed for the last 3 years, and it's ongoing. What other learnings have you taken from the cannabis industry that you've successfully applied to the psychedelic space? Second question: what doesn't translate? That might be the more interesting question. But what did you learn in the cannabis industry that you've been able to bring over, and what haven't you?
Yeah, I think. Primarily the first thing was that psychedelics are going to require a whole new set of infrastructure, much like cannabis did. Cannabis is not typically prescribed in the average doctor's office. You needed a whole new system for the production, administration, and distribution of cannabis. And we expect much of the same thing for psychedelics. And that's why we're building the clinical infrastructure. And that's why we're getting into product development, that there's a whole bunch of work to be done to really make this sustainable and scalable. I think that's one of the biggest lessons. I think the other big lesson is the best way to drive mainstream adoption is to not be cowboys or cowgirls, as the case may be, in terms of how we approach it. We want to be conservative, thoughtful, prudent practitioners of medicine, because what we saw in the cannabis industry was that by being thoughtful and prudent, what would happen is we would open a new clinic in, say, St. Catharines. And again, we needed referrals for our patients. And so a patient would go to their doctor, and their doctor, may have been a little bit skeptical about cannabis medicine, but maybe they gave a referral. And so we saw that patient and we prescribed cannabis, and then we did it professionally, or we didn't prescribe cannabis because the patient wasn't suitable. And the doctor saw that. The referring doctor said, hey, these guys are not just writing tickets for cannabis, they are doing real medicine. And then we'd follow up with a consultation letter back to the referring doctor saying, hey, we saw your patient. They came in presenting with this. We're not taking over care. We're just practicing cannabis medicine. We prescribed this amount of cannabis. and we'd continue to follow up. And then that doctor who referred would see that the patient started doing a lot better and the quality of their life improved. And the doctor would say, hey, this is real medicine. And then they'd refer another patient and then another patient, and then they'd talk to another doctor. And it became a much more scalable thing because you were getting doctors sending 10, 20, 30, 40, 50 patients to our clinics instead of trying to like attract, the average person who wanted to get cannabis. So it just made the marketing much more scalable by doing it slower and more thoughtfully. And the same thing is going to apply here. What's different about cannabis versus psychedelics? I think the biggest one is that it's a little bit easier because the evidence is around psychedelics is much higher, right? It's more likely than not that the first access to psychedelics is going to come in the form of some FDA approval. Most likely it'll be MAPS getting approval for using MDMA to treat PTSD sometime in 2022, 2023, which means they went through the 3-phase clinical trials, random controlled, double-blind random controlled placebo trials and all that kind of stuff. So the conversation to the referring community is going to be much easier. There's no skepticism. The evidence is there. They just don't have the infrastructure. We have the infrastructure. So that's one of the big differences. I think the other big difference is that this is not a product. Cannabis is a product. Cannabis medicine was kind of a vetting to make sure cannabis was appropriate. Here, it's the entire experience. When it comes to psychedelics, there's really 3 levers that can be pulled. It's the choice of molecule, it's the set and setting, and it's the choice of therapeutic protocol. So it's a much more complex therapeutic regime than cannabis, which was more like, do you qualify? Yes or no. Is appropriate? Yes or no. And then, there was definitely some triaging and decision making to be made around what products were suitable for the patient in cannabis. But that was the end of the road here. The choice of product is just the start, and then it gets complex from there. So I think those are the primary differences between the two.
So any thoughts on the global market, or actually, no, I'm going to put one other question before this.
Sure.
I'm assuming you've done some traveling around, when we were able to travel.
Yeah.
What was the sort of global perception of psychedelics and the advances that have been made in North America?
I've been surprised. Psychedelics are much more ubiquitous than anyone, I think, would have conceived of. A year and a half ago, not more than cannabis, no, certainly not more than cannabis, but much more than I think people would believe. I think cannabis was much more ubiquitous before it started getting legalized, and all people came out and started talking about how they smoked cannabis, but it was still closer to the surface than psychedelics. Psychedelics, I think, are still farther down. But, when we launched Field Trip, within like a month of launching Field Trip, I was at a restaurant in East York in Toronto. And I heard a conversation between the bar and the server was talking about how she'd just done a boatload of mushrooms and her mental health had been better than it had been in weeks. And the bartender was like, oh yeah, I did LSD when I was suicidal once and it totally fixed me. And I'm like, this is like much more mainstream, at least in cosmopolitan centers, than I really expected. And I think it's much more of the conversation. I think not to get into the conversation about millennials and Gen X and Gen Y and all that kind of stuff, but I think, people who in their 20s or 30s have a very different attitudes. We see it in terms of their drinking habits. People in their 20s, the millennials drink less on average, use cannabis more, and I think are more open to integrative and plant-based medicines than others. So I think it just hasn't risen to the surface. It hasn't become quite a mainstream conversation, but it is now much more so. And again, it's a lot easier of a conversation to have because even though these molecules are scheduled, the evidence is abundant, right? So it's just a matter of time. Whereas even with cannabis, the evidence is still well behind where it is with psychedelics. And look how fast things shifted around cannabis. when we launched Canadian Cannabis Clinics in 2014 at the conference we actually launched at, doctors would give us a wide berth. They'd walk, two rows out of their way to avoid our booth because they didn't want anything to do with cannabis. The next year, a few more people stopped by, and by the third year at that conference, we were probably one of the most popular booths. That's a huge shift for a quite conservative community, right? And
Oh my!
and
I was just looking at some of the numbers of, just literally today, looking at some of the numbers of previous, conferences, MJ BizCon and other conferences, and they quite literally double in size every year.
Yeah. Absolutely. And, with psychedelics, it's just like, it's part of the whole plant-based medicine thing. I think a lot, part of the step up and the reason this is happening is I think the opioid crisis really destroyed faith in a lot of what the pharmaceutical and biotech industry stood for, rightly or wrongly. That's where we are. And so people are looking for more natural alternatives. And what's cool about psychedelics, even though many of them are not natural, like LSD or MDMA, they still get lumped in. But what's cool about them is they're safe and they're effective. The evidence seems pretty clear about that. So, unlike some other natural herbal supplements that may have dubious, medical or health-related claims, here there's almost no ambiguity around it. So it makes it a lot easier of a conversation. And even though still takes time and there's still stigma, I think that stigma is going to fall down much faster based on the experience with cannabis and based on just the evidence that's starting to emerge.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So you just touched on the opioid epidemic, and it's very telling that we've seen in Canada specifically. I'm going to talk about a spike in opioid deaths and overdoses during this pandemic. Blue sky thinking. Do you have hope for psychedelics to hopefully step in, and what needs to be done to allow enough access or enough enough infrastructure to, step in on things like this? We can't possibly in Canada have, opioid overdoses and deaths spike like that on an ongoing basis. So, what needs to happen to prevent this?
That's a good question, and one I don't have a wonderful answer to. I think
we only have 10 minutes left.
Fair enough. Listen, the opioid crisis was a function, I think, of many convergent circumstances, some within control, some not in control. I think, with opioids, my sense, but I don't have the data to back this up, is that most people got addicted to opioids not because they were using them recreationally, but they were actually prescribed them properly and got addicted because the information that was provided around their safety profiles was misleading or altogether inaccurate. So I think the opioid crisis is not a reflection necessarily of a mental health crisis. I don't know that people necessarily got addicted to opioids because they were trying to escape their feelings. Certainly part of the people who have addiction problems with opioids were doing it for that reason, but I think a lot of people just got hooked for very legitimate reasons. And so will psychedelics provide a solution? I think, yeah, in many ways, psychedelics do present a potential solution in a few avenues. One is there seems to be some evidence that ibogaine and ibogaine-related therapies may actually address opioid addiction. I don't know about that, but, there seems to be a lot of interest in that respect. So there's one avenue. Another avenue is that, for instance, a lot of chronic pain can be very psychological. We just had a patient through our clinic this week, actually, who had suffered debilitating chronic back pain for years. He's a military veteran. And within his first ketamine session, something was unpacked and he reported that his back pain had largely subsided. Now, ketamine is also an anesthetic, so that may have part of it. There may be some aspect and there may be some placebo, but I genuinely believe that part of it was because we physically hold stress. We don't talk about this very much in modern medicine, but we physically hold stress in our bodies chemically and physically. We tense our shoulders and all that kind of stuff, and that leads to misalignments and all kinds of things. And so when you can start to process all of that emotion, it's going to naturally lead to changes in perceptions and changes in pain. So, to the extent that psychedelics may present a potential solution, and I know there's some research going on in this towards treating pain, because they are also, at least psilocybin and LSD, are actually anti-inflammatory molecules as well. So there may actually be an acute aspect to their treatments in terms of managing pain. So there's a lot of aspects in which I think psychedelics could potentially address the opioid crisis. But it's, I think 2 or 3 steps down the line. I think the focus needs to be right now is get the evidence, show that they're very effective for the things we're pretty certain that they're effective for, like depression, anxiety, PTSD, and then kind of go from there. I think if we try and suggest that psychedelics are a panacea for everything, we risk them becoming the new CBD, which, again, CBD is a wonderful molecule, but it's certainly been overhyped. And I think that's going to be negative for its potential impact, and certainly not going to be negative for the overall industry until things level out.
Absolutely. Yeah. So if you go in believing that this one thing is going to cure all, it leaves the space. It's not being true to oneself, and it leaves the market open for those who would take advantage of that. And
it also leads to incredible disappointment, right? Being like, hey, this cures everything. Oh, wait, it doesn't. And, it all of a sudden develops a reputation that is undeservedly negative as well. So. And
so just in terms of, collecting that evidence. What actually, I'm gonna kind of do 2 questions in one. I feel like I have been doing this entire time, but I want to know about next steps for Field Trip, and about collecting that data that can be used to better inform patients, and better inform clinicians, and better inform policymakers. So.
Yeah, so next steps for us, is really just execute on the business model we touched on before, which is roll out the clinics, advance our work on psilocybin mushrooms, as well as on FT104. And, my role in all of this is trying to drive the mainstream conversation. So it's, everybody can talk about this around the dinner table. In terms of evidence collection, it's central to how we're building our clinics and the patient experience. And, for FT104, as soon as we put that into clinical trials, by definition, we'll be collecting a ton of evidence around that. With ketamine, we're going to just be doing internal observational studies. We're not, at least at this point, seeking any formal REB approved studies around ketamine-assisted psychotherapy, but we are very much building the experience to try and collect a lot of information. So there's the conventional clinical diagnoses and what's the word? The metrics around depression and depression scores and all that kind of stuff. So we're certainly collecting that. But, this mental health does translate into physical health. And so we're going to be trying to track patients tracking them with their biometrics. So, providing patients with monitors that monitor their HRV, which seems to be a very strong indicator of stress levels and the balance of the sympathetic and parasympathetic nervous system.
What's HRV?
Heart rate variability. It's kind of a measure between the sympathetic and parasympathetic systems, which should not always be in balance. They should be flowing back and forth. And different sort of biometrics to follow people, blood pressure, heart rate, all of these kind of things that don't necessarily get reflected in the conventional diagnostic scores. So we can get a more holistic picture of what's happening to these patients. Because, one of the things we'll see, and we're already seeing with some of our patients, is that they come in with treatment-resistant depression, but their depression scores may be relatively low. And so taking someone from a 5 to a 4 is a significant improvement for them, but it doesn't look as good as taking someone from a 10 to a 5, right? Or whatever the case may be. And so we want to show that there are a number of different metrics outside of the conventional diagnostic scores that show real improvement for these people, because, you know, when it really comes down to it, mental health and the practice of psychiatry, and I think psychedelics are the stepping stone for this, needs to step out of the brain and look at the entire system of what's going on and how to measure. And so we'll be very active in doing that, again, for our own purposes to start, but whether we'll publish any data or not, you know, I imagine we probably will, but we're still pretty early stage. So we want to see what's going on and really figure out how to dial in and drive the best results, and then try and use that to develop those protocols, and then becomes much easier to publish.
Right. Patients first, right?
Absolutely. You know, we're an evidence and outcomes based organization. You know, we and certainly, like, I think all of us have our political philosophies, and I think mine have shone through a little bit. But at the end of the day, we follow the data. You know, I don't profess to be smarter than what the evidence says. I have my beliefs and my expectations and my assumptions, but they can always be fixed or corrected or improved based on what the data shows.
Absolutely. I want to, before we wrap this up, I want to invite you to, you know, plug anything that the general public should be, you know, looking into in terms of Field Trip or any of the, you know, initiatives that surround it.
Sure. You know, if you want information about Field Trip and our program, visit our website at fieldtriphealth.com. I'd also strongly encourage everyone who's listening to tune into our podcast, which is Field Tripping. The website for that is fieldtripping.fm, like the radio station. We've managed to land some amazing people to come in and talk about their experiences. The goal with Field Tripping is really to normalize the conversation. It's certainly a community that can be not exclusive, but it seems like almost like an elite community in a small community. So you got like Rick Doblin and all of these well-known names within the psychedelic community. And I'm really trying to expand that so that, you know, people that you can relate to outside of science and psychology can speak to it. So we've had, you know, Dr. Andrew Weil, who's the father of integrative medicine, on. We've had Director X. Actually, I think yesterday we published a podcast with Director X, who directed some of the biggest music videos you could imagine, as well as Superfly.
Out of Toronto, right? Or out of Canada, but probably.
Yeah, he's in Scarborough. That's right. Yeah. So we got Alex Icon, who's, you know, developed products that Tim Ferriss describes in the tools of Titans. Like, we've got some really amazing people coming on to talk about their psychedelic experiences and where it's taken them. Tomorrow we're recording with Humble the Poet. You know, we've got some musicians lined up for our second season as well, big name musicians. So it's super cool, and it's all about just like making this a normal conversation. And beyond that, it's like, I think there's power in sharing. There's power in vulnerability, certainly. But I think people can learn from other people's experiences, and, you know, when you're going through a tough time, knowing that uber successful people and uber famous people have gone through almost identical circumstances. For a lot of people, not everybody, for a lot of people, that's a very soothing, calming, you know, sustaining kind of understanding. And then so that's what we're trying to do, is just put it out there and let people learn from other people's experiences.
Absolutely. One thing I've learned from the psychedelic space is that the anecdotal evidence and the storytelling is a major part of it, and a major part of how the, you know, the information of how to collect these substances, how to take these substances, how to, you know, everything about them is very, very word of mouth, very community centric. So fieldtripping.fm is what we should tune into. I can't wait to listen. Are you doing the interviews yourself?
Yeah, it's me doing them. So yeah.
Awesome. Well, I'm sure they're better than my interviewing skills, but I'm so happy to have you here so that I can practice. And yeah, it's just so nice to have you here with us for another Microdose Psychedelics Insiders. You're you know, you're well known in the industry. I know that a lot of people will be really interested to hear what you have to say. So I can't wait to broadcast this. And again, I thank you so much. And for everyone who is tuned in live, thank you so much for joining us. This will be available as a podcast soon after we finish. And definitely check out Field Trip, Ronan Levy, and fieldtripping.fm. Thank you, everyone.
Thanks so much.
Thank you, Ronan. Sorry.
Thanks for having me. Your interview skills are excellent, and trust me, my interview skills are made much better by a good producer and editor. So I'm sure you'll do great.
Fair. Well, good night to everyone, and thank you again. We'll talk to you soon, I hope.
Absolutely. Bye-bye.
Bye.
Thanks for joining the Psychedelic Insider series, brought to you by Microdose and the Conscious Fund. Visit our website at www.microdose.buzz.